This lecture is going to cover the group called the Hemichordata. The hemichordates are sister to the Echinodermata, and they're our last group before we get into our final big subclade called the chordata. And the name Hemichordata and its similarity to the name chordata is not by accident. So the synapomorphies for the chordata, one includes a support structure called the stomacord that's found in the head region and provides a little bit of skeletal support for the organisms. They also have a unique excretory structure called the glomerulus. And then they have two characteristics that are also seen in the chordates, a dorsal nerve cord and pharyngeal gill slits. Now this may be a synapomorphy for this group and have evolved independently, but it may have actually evolved earlier in the group that eventually gave rise to the entire deuterostomia. So we'll talk a little bit more about this when we go through the chordates. It's a fairly small group, only 100 to 200 species of these benthic marine worms. They're commonly referred to as the acorn worms. They spend their lives as burrowing worms, typically in a solitary situation, in one big group, shown here. There's another group that is quite different morphologically, and they also differ behaviorally, found in these colonial situations. The triploblastic eucoelomate animals, showing bilateral symmetry. They have three regions: a head, which is oftentimes referred to as the proboscis, a collar region that is where the mouth is located, and then some of these, the colonial ones, have tentacles in this region. The largest part of the body is the trunk, and this is where we see pharyngeal gill slit, seen in this image here. This is also where we see the digestive tract. It's a complete digestive tract that has a posterior anus in most forms. We'll see that there's a U-shaped gut in other forms. And this is also where we have the gonads. They have a glandular epithelium that produces a large amount of mucus that's used both in feeding and it serves as protection against predation. They're fairly soft animals, having support primarily through hydrostatic coelomic support. But they do have a few solid elements. So the proboscis has this skeletal plate, which is shown here. And next to it is also what is called the stomacord. Also in this figure, it's referred to as the buccal diverticulum. There are also solid pharyngeal arches, shown here in the pharynx. The colonial forms secrete a tube around them called the coensia. And this is a non-living structure, but it does provide some support for the organisms. They have both circular and longitudinal muscles in most cases, and these are used for locomotion in the errant forms. It's used also in the retraction of the proboscis, so they can open and close the mouth, as you see in this picture on the bottom left. And then those that are living in these tubes, they can retract these colonial forms into these coensia using these muscles. They actually have three longitudinal nerve cords. Two of these are relatively small and superficial to the epithelium, so we have a dorsal and ventral small nerve cord. But then the main one is this deeper, much larger dorsal nerve cord. And this is quite different from most of the animals that we've covered previously that had a ventral nerve cord. From this larger nerve cord, they have sensory and motor neurons radiating to various parts of the body, including tactile and chemosensory cells on the body surface. This is most well developed in the errant crawling forms. Those that are sessile colonial ones have a much reduced nervous system. So again, most of these are crawling errant benthic worms, either on the surface or burrowing. But again, those that are colonial or sessile as adults. They show both suspension and deposit feeding. And this is where the mucus comes into play. The proboscis actually produces this mucus, which is used to capture food. This mucus with the food in it is moved to the mouth via cilia, and additional food is captured through the mucus-covered pharyngeal gill slits. So food can be brought into the mouth and then also through the gill slits. The colonial forms have additional feeding structures, these tentacled arms that are also covered in mucus, and they capture food, and then cilia drives the food and mucus to the mouth. They have a complete digestive system, a mouth at the anterior end, kind of also on the bottom part, kind of the ventral surface in the collar region. Food that enters the mouth and passes through the pharynx, esophagus, and the intestines. The intestines have lots of folds and branches for increased absorption of nutrients. As I mentioned, this is a U-shaped gut in the colonial forms, and so instead of a posterior anus, the anus opens up back at the anterior end of the animal. They have a partially open circulatory system, so they do have limited vessels that go both anterior and posterior, dorsally and ventrally, but in between these dorsal and ventral vessels, they just empty into blood sinuses. Movement of the blood is through a pumping of the heart and also just through muscle contractions of the body. So respiration is through the cutaneous surface. These are relatively high surface area animals living in an aquatic environment, so cutaneous respiration is possible. But then they also exchange gases associated with these pharyngeal gill slits. One of the unique structures located near the heart is used for excretion. This is called the glomerulus. Blood is passed from the heart through this glomerulus for filtration, and then nitrogenous wastes are eliminated from the body. And these animals, like all the other animals we've talked about thus far, are ectothermic. Asexual reproduction is fairly common, associated with fragmentation and multiple fission, and budding is very common to produce the individuals in the colonial forms. So a living colony is actually produced by these asexually produced zooids. As far as sexual reproduction goes, they're dioecious typically, with gonads lining the trunk in a body region called the genital wings. They're oviparous, with typically having external fertilization. They are deuterostome, showing radial holoblastic cleavage, but there is a deviation. Neither the mouth nor the anus develop from the blastopore. They formed secondarily elsewhere. Most hemichordates produce a planktonic dispersal form called the Tornaria larva. After external fertilization, the eggs are brooded in the coensia in the colonial form, so they do provide a little bit of parental care in that situation, but it's actually outside of their body, so they're still considered oviparous. Not really much is known about the lifespan. They can repair some injuries and regenerate body parts, so there may be the potential for extended life, but it's really not been studied. As far as defenses go, the mucus, which is used in foraging, also appears to have some toxins to limit predation. Most of the errant forms are solitary, but the one main lineage does produce these colonial species that can form these dense aggregations of asexually produced individuals living in their own individual coensia tubes. There are no known symbiotic relationships with hemichordates. These are marine, mostly benthic as adults and pelagic as larvae, but they have not really been well studied as far as their ecosystem functioning. So in review, this is the acorn worms, a relatively small group of triploblastic eucoelomate bilaterally symmetrical worms. They have 3 body regions, the proboscis, a collar, and a trunk. They have a glandular epidermis that produces lots of mucus for feeding and protection. Support, they have a variety of structures. It's primarily hydrostatic support, but some of the solid structures include the stomacord, the pharyngeal gill arches themselves, and in the colonial forms, these external tubes they live in called the coensia. They have circular and longitudinal muscles, and a number of nerve cords running the length of the body, 2 relatively small superficial, 1 ventral, 1 dorsal, but then they have a much larger, deeper dorsal nerve cord. They have a variety of sensory structures, both mechano and chemoreceptors spread throughout their body. And while most are benthic and crawling, the colonial forms are sessile. They show both suspension and deposit feeders, and this is where the mucus is important for helping to capture that food and drive it to the mouth using cilia. They have a complete digestive tract, an open circulatory system with limited vessels that dump into blood sinuses. Respiration is in large part cutaneous, but is also accomplished through the pharyngeal gill slits. They have a unique excretory structure called the glomerulus. They're ectothermic. They do show asexual budding, multiple fission, and fragmentation. This is particularly important in the colonial species for the production of zooids. Sexually, they're dioecious, oviparous, with external fertilization, but you do see some brooding in the colonial forms. They are in the deuterostome clade, and they show radioholoblastic cleavage, but the blastopore fate is neither turning into the mouth or the anus. And then the mucus that we talked about that is used in foraging is also used in their defense.